Hello, my name is Richard Albert, and today I'm going to be interviewing Ozan Varol of Lewis and Clark Law School. And our subject today will be trends in modern authoritarian governance, a very provocative, timely subject. Ozan, thank you very much for your time today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Fantastic. Let's get started. Let me ask you, how are modern authoritarian regimes different from their historical predecessors?
Well, historically, many authoritarians maintain power by torturing and murdering dissidents, jailing journalists, rigging elections, and shutting down courts and legislatures. They disregarded laws and constitutions and engaged in numerous illegal and unconstitutional efforts to eliminate checks on their power. Although laws have always been a powerful tool in a dictator's arsenal, modern authoritarians have begun to rely on formal rules, like laws and constitutions, to maintain political power to a much greater extent than their historical predecessors. In so doing, these newer generations of authoritarians hide repressive measures under the mask of law. They imbue them with the appearance of some level of legitimacy, and they also render authoritarian practices much more difficult to detect and eliminate. So as a result, there has been an increased attention in the legal scholarship to the use of formal rules by authoritarian governments. Traditionally, it's been assumed that formal rules are of very little relevance to authoritarian leaders who are presumed to rely on more informal mechanisms of coercion and control. But a recent line of scholars have argued that formal rules do matter in authoritarian governance. So I'll mention a few examples. Tom Ginsburg and Alberto Simcer recently published an edited volume that explores the functions of constitutions and authoritarian governments. Mark Tushnet has a forthcoming paper on authoritarian constitutionalism. David Landau published an article titled Abusive Constitutionalism that discusses how authoritarians use mechanisms of constitutional amendment and replacement to erode the democratic order. Kim-Lane Shepely likewise has authored a series of articles that analyze how the Viktor Orban government in Hungary launched what she calls a constitutional coup and created a dominant party state using the mechanisms of constitutional amendment and replacement. And finally, I wrote an article titled Self-Authoritarianism, which is forthcoming in the Iowa Law Review, that explores how modern authoritarians have learned to rely on the same legal and particularly sub-constitutional mechanisms that also exist in regimes with favorable democratic credentials in order to maintain political power.
So you're in good company with the subject that you're writing on. So Ozan, if modern authoritarians are above the law, as it were, what explains their increased reliance on law and constitutions?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the end of the Cold War, I think, is a significant turning point in the story. The Cold War ushered in an era of democracy promotion programs intended to detect and eliminate transparently authoritarian practices. So the United States, for example, enacted numerous laws and regulations to promote democracy. By 1998, it had set up democracy promotion programs in over 100 countries. NGOs also joined this democracy promotion chorus, working on the ground to ensure that countries are adopting democratic laws, constitutions, and institutions. Democracy clauses were also placed in international agreements to sanction regimes that assume power through illegal means. So all of those measures combined significantly raised the costs of using transparently repressive practices and provided significant incentives to avoid them. So much like a virus that mutates to adapt to new antidotes, some authoritarians and would-be authoritarians learn to play by the same rules that exist in democratic governments. So in the modern era, authoritarian wolves rarely appear as wolves. They're now clad, at least in part, in sheep's clothing.
It's really fascinating and also quite troubling. Can you help us understand how constitutions can serve the goals, the objectives of authoritarians?
Sure. So the essays in Tom Ginsburg and Alberto Simcer's edited volume really thoroughly analyze why constitutions in authoritarian regimes matter. So they matter, they argue, for a number of purposes. Constitutions can serve as operating manuals in authoritarian regimes by detailing the roles that various institutions are going to play. They can help authoritarian leaders to monitor and sanction lower-level bureaucratic agents. Constitutions can also function as billboards, they argue, and provide information to domestic and global audiences. And finally, they can serve as window dressing, essentially, to provide democratic veneer and satisfy domestic and global audiences and facilitate investment and economic growth.
So that's what constitutions can do. What about laws and other sub-constitutional legal mechanisms? What kinds of functions can they serve in authoritarian regimes?
So similar to constitutions, laws can provide powerful mechanisms to authoritarian leaders to suppress dissent and to tilt the electoral playing field in their favor. So I'll mention a couple of examples. Instead of jailing journalists without due process or overtly shutting down media outlets, political leaders are increasingly relying on costly libel lawsuits to silence political dissidents. So numerous countries as diverse as Turkey, Russia, Singapore, Croatia, Cameroon, Malaysia, Ukraine, and Belarus have experienced a significant upsurge of libel lawsuits against government critics. Another popular mechanism is the use of non-political crimes, so crimes like tax evasion and money laundering, to prosecute government critics and political opponents. Prosecution often involves selective, though legally accurate, applications of the existing criminal laws. Because the prosecutions are also often supported with sufficient evidence of guilt, it essentially allows the government to portray the prosecution to domestic and global audiences as a legitimate application of the rule of law. So I'll give you an example from Turkey. In Turkey, tax crimes have become a popular tool for punishing political dissidents. Most media companies in Turkey are subsidiaries of larger corporations. That structure permits the government to reward corporations with friendly media subsidiaries with government contracts and punish others with tax fines. So in 2009, a $2.5 billion tax fine was levied against the largest media company in Turkey after then Prime Minister Erdogan asked the Turkish public to boycott its newspapers for publishing critical commentary. Another example is the use of electoral laws. So electoral laws are particularly prone to abuse since they set the basic rules of the democratic game. And those laws can be reconfigured for seemingly legitimate and neutral-sounding purposes like eliminating electoral fraud or promoting political stability in order to raise the costs of unseating the incumbents. In addition, modern authoritarians have also come to adopt surveillance laws and surveillance institutions, and these are often adopted with the backing of international institutions with a purported purpose of combating organized crime and terrorism. But then those laws are employed to blackmail or discredit political opponents. So all of these practices combined tilt the electoral playing field in favor of the incumbents, and that in turn can undermine a core component of democracy, which is competitive multi-party elections and the resulting turnover in government power.
Ozan, what I really enjoyed about your paper on stealth authoritarianism is that it helps us understand the limits of formal institutions, texts. So you help us understand how texts can be overridden sub-constitutionally. So it's a really fascinating and I think important paper. But it's also scary to me. So I wonder if you can maybe reflect on what the future of constitutional authoritarianism portends, not only for law, but for the future of constitutionalism.
Yeah, that's a great and a difficult to answer question. On the one hand, some of these formal mechanisms present a lesser moral evil than the traditional mechanisms of authoritarian control. So, for example, suing journalists for libel is better than torturing them. At the same time, though, these newer mechanisms may create a more durable form of authoritarianism. So the use of these mechanisms can allow incumbents to retain power by appeasing global and domestic audiences and by disabling political opponents through seemingly legitimate means, and that can prolong then the duration of the authoritarian regime. But I think there is also the possibility, at least in some cases, that the use of these legal mechanisms can eventually usher in democratization. Although these practices are anti-democratic in effect, they might, in some cases, produce the dynamics by which democracy can expand in sort of a 2 steps forward, 1 step backward dynamic. The rejection of openly repressive authoritarian tactics and the adoption of legal mechanisms that exist in democratic countries can eventually open up a democratic Pandora's box, at least in some cases.
So there may be light at the end of the tunnel. You want to paint a promising portrait at the end of the day.
Not necessarily. I think, again, there's sort of two directions in which this can proceed. One is to create a more durable form of authoritarianism, which can happen in certain cases, or in some cases this can actually lead to democratization. But I think the eventual outcome depends on a confluence of social, political, and cultural factors that probably warrant further study.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Ozan, I'm holding a copy of your most recent paper, which I've been skimming today because you're going to be presenting it at Boston College at the end of this month. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about it. It's called Constitutional Stickiness. Constitutional Stickiness. What is the paper about?
Certainly. So empirical evidence shows that during constitutional redesign processes, existing constitutional provisions tend to stick or remain substantively unchanged. So constitution makers frequently don't change existing provisions even where these provisions are arbitrary, they're not optimal, or they're out of sync with prevailing societal values. So in other words, many constitutions end up where they are because they happen to start there, not because that starting point enjoys a distinct normative advantage. So in this article, I'm exploring the causes of constitutional stickiness, what causes constitutions or constitutional provisions to stick, and I'm also analyzing its normative implications. That study, I think, promises to reveal important insights as well as some troubling conclusions for modern constitutional theory.
And are you finding that the kinds of constitutional provisions that stick are those that are more like entrenching structures rather than things like rights and liberties?
I think that's right. So all things being equal, constitutional structure will tend to stick more than individual rights. In the individual rights area, it's easier especially to add individual rights provisions as opposed to subtract them. When you do have entrenched structural provisions, say like a presidential system that's been around for decades, those structures can become much more difficult to alter as compared to individual rights provisions. That's right.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing the presentation in person at the end of this month here at Boston College. I promised you I wouldn't take up much of your time today, but if I could ask just one more question, I'd love to know how you got interested in comparative public law. When did you decide, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to read, this is what I want to write?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. You know, I was an astrophysics major in undergrad, so law school was sort of a second career for me. But the moment when I realized that comparative public law is my passion is my first year constitutional law class. I was sitting and learning about the U.S. Constitution, and instinctively, having grown up in Turkey and having been born and raised there, and I lived there for 17 years before coming to the United States, instinctively I was comparing everything I learned in my U.S. constitutional law class with what I knew about the Turkish constitution. So it really was second nature for me to go into this field.
So it was inevitable that we would be talking with Professor Ozan Varol, expert in comparative public law.
Thank you, Richard.
Ozan, thanks very much. This has been great. Obviously, I've learned a lot, and this is always so fascinating. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.